Sochi, Russia, September 8, 2025. In a scene both symbolic and strategic, Russian President Vladimir Putin walked into a dimly lit conference room inside his Sochi residence and sat before a screen carrying the faces of fellow BRICS leaders. On the other end of the line were China's Xi Jinping, Brazil's Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa, and India's Narendra Modi. Together, the five leaders represented nearly half of the world's population and a growing share of its economic output. The occasion was the latest BRICS summit, this one hosted virtually amid a global backdrop of war, economic turbulence, and shifting alliances. While the gathering carried the usual diplomatic formalities, it was Putin's presence, and more importantly his words, that were most closely watched. Yet, in a move that underscored both secrecy and calculation, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov announced before the session that Putin's remarks would not be made public. Peskov confirmed it plainly on Monday. President Putin's speech will not be released to the media. That decision sent analysts scrambling. Why shield the remarks of Russia's leader at a moment when BRICS is positioning itself as the voice of the global south? Was it a matter of sensitive content or a tactical silence aimed at keeping rivals guessing? Inside the conference hall, cameras briefly captured Putin's arrival, a solitary walk toward his desk, the Russian tricolour placed carefully behind him, screens glowing with the live feeds of his counterparts. For a few moments, journalists caught sight of Brazil's President Lula da Silva delivering his opening address. The Russian feed then cut back to Putin, who sat listening with his hands clasped. No audio was released. To the world outside, the silence was deafening. The absence of Putin's words created an information vacuum, one that was quickly filled by speculation. Still, even without his speech being published, the optics carried meaning. The Kremlin wanted audiences at home and abroad to see Putin as part of a club of rising powers, not isolated by Western sanctions and wars. The BRICS platform provided him that stage. The BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has grown in weight over the past decade. Once dismissed as a loose acronym invented by economists, it has become a platform for countries that want alternatives to Western-led institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and G7. In recent years, BRICS has expanded its agenda from economic cooperation to political coordination. Leaders have openly discussed new financial systems, joint security initiatives, and even alternatives to the US dollar in trade. For Russia, facing heavy sanctions after its invasion of Ukraine, BRICS is no longer just a talking shop. It is a diplomatic lifeline. Putin's participation in this summit, even virtually, underlined Moscow's refusal to be sidelined. Russia remains a full member, welcomed on equal footing with China and Brazil. And while his speech was hidden, the fact of his presence spoke volumes. Observers noted that the summit began with Brazilian President Lula da Silva delivering a pointed opening. Lula has positioned himself as a voice for peace in Ukraine and Gaza, often calling for negotiations where the West has focused on military aid. Lula's tone, according to sources familiar with his draft remarks, emphasized cooperation and independence from great power rivalries. His words hinted at the desire of many global South nations to avoid being trapped in a binary choice between Washington and Moscow or between Beijing and Brussels. Putin listened carefully. His expression remained unreadable. The Kremlin's insistence on keeping Putin's remarks private is unusual but not unprecedented. Russian officials have increasingly controlled the president's messaging since the Ukraine war entered its fourth year. What Putin says to allies is often different from the narrative broadcast to domestic audiences. Peskov's statement, President Putin's speech will not be released to the media, was a reminder that Russia values control over exposure. By withholding the content, Moscow ensured that only those inside the BRICS meeting could interpret his tone and intent. This strategy also projects exclusivity. BRICS is presented as a private club, where leaders exchange words shielded from outside scrutiny. That too can be a form of soft power. Analysts suggest several reasons why Putin's speech might have been withheld. Ukraine and Gaza. Both conflicts are at the heart of global debates. Putin may have offered positions that he did not want Western media to twist or amplify. Economic cooperation. Russia's push for trade in national currencies, bypassing the US dollar, could have been a sensitive topic. Announcing it too openly risks triggering financial countermeasures. China-Russia coordination. Given the depth of Moscow's ties with Beijing, some of Putin's remarks may have been directed at Xi Jinping personally. Making them public could dilute their weight. Domestic considerations. Putin's speech may have contained concessions or cautious language that he preferred not to circulate back home, where hardline narratives dominate. Whatever the reason, the secrecy itself became the story. Putin's decision to cloak his words also reflected the pressures he faces. Russia's war in Ukraine has reached a grinding stalemate. Sanctions continue to squeeze the economy, and diplomatic space in the West remains closed. Within this context, BRICS is not just a summit. It is a rare forum where Putin is treated as a peer rather than a pariah. Images from Sochi showed him leaning slightly toward the camera, nodding occasionally as other leaders spoke. The symbolism was unmistakable. Russia is still in the room, still claiming influence in global affairs. For Putin, the most critical partner on that call was Xi Jinping. The Sino-Russian partnership has deepened since 2022, built on shared opposition to Western dominance and mutual economic benefits. China has become a key market for Russian energy, while Moscow supports Beijing's calls for a multipolar world order. Though Xi's remarks were not fully released at the same time, Chinese state media hinted at themes of unity and resistance against unilateral sanctions. For Putin, such echoes are essential. Together, Russia and China form the backbone of BRICS's political identity. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, officially hosting the summit, emphasized inclusivity and the bloc's role in representing developing nations. His team released images showing him nodding as Putin appeared on screen. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, meanwhile, has walked a careful line. New Delhi continues to purchase Russian oil while maintaining strong ties with Washington. Modi's presence was a reminder that BRICS is not simply a Russia-China alliance. It is a more complex gathering where interests diverge as much as they overlap. Journalists noted the tight choreography of the Sochi images. Putin's solitary walk to the desk lasted only seconds. The camera angle was wide, the lighting stark, projecting a sense of authority. When he sat down, the feed lingered on his attentive listening. The silence of the broadcast, no sound, no subtitles, added to the mystique. These images, though mundane at first glance, were crafted to deliver a message. Putin is still engaged, still relevant, still commanding Russia's place among global powers. Even in silence, summits like this shape perceptions. For Russia, the key outcome was not what was said, but what was shown. By appearing alongside leaders of major economies, Putin reinforced his claim that Russia is not isolated. It is simply aligned with a different set of partners. For the BRICS bloc, the episode highlighted its growing role as a stage for alternative voices. The fact that the Kremlin could hide Putin's words while still projecting strength shows the flexibility of this alliance. BRICS is less about binding rules and more about shared defiance of Western dominance. In the end, the September 8th summit will be remembered less for what was said than for what was withheld. Putin's hidden speech became a story of its own, a reminder that in modern diplomacy, silence can be as powerful as words. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov crystallized it with his brief announcement. President Putin's speech will not be released to the media. For a leader navigating isolation, war, and economic strain, that silence was strategic. It allowed Putin to speak freely to allies, shield his words from critics, and reinforce the image of Russia as an indispensable part of the global conversation.
Дорогие друзья, приветствую всех участников, всех глав государств.
Diversifying our trade and investment partnerships with Africa,